there was this man. He had a beautiful family, 5 children. And this one day he sheared all his sheep because he was a shepherd. And so he was going and bundled all this stuff up together, kissed his wife goodbye, and hugged all his children. And he left to Jerusalem. He went up this mountain to the city where he could sell his wool and he could make money to provide for his family. Now on the way up there, as he was turning the corner, all of a sudden out of nowhere, these men jumped him and came out of nowhere. They beat him. They left him bruised and bloodied on the side of a road. And he sat there, laying there, thinking, what am I going to do now? We've been going over the Sermon on the Mount and going over specifically what is called the Beatitudes, which are just small sayings of Jesus that hold incredible weight, to where we've been going just over one verse each week. Beatitudes like, God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. God blesses those who are merciful. God blesses those who are pure in heart. God blesses those who work for peace. And then we come to this week's verse, Matthew chapter 5, verse 10. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Doing right. That's a pretty general, that is a pretty general term. We don't really know how to do right. Be kind to other people. Don't be a jerk. Help those who need help. But we can also have different motives in doing right. That's what I want to talk about today, is our motivations for how we do right. And to do right, there's a fancy word that the Bible uses called righteousness. And so I'm going to use that a lot today, but when I say righteousness, it just means acts in doing right. It means that because of your actions, you are proven right. And so let's talk about righteousness, because there's a story I want to go over. Some of you kind of picked it up from the beginning, but there's a story in Luke. And it's called the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so we pick it up as this man is beaten and bruised on the side of the road. And in Luke chapter 10, verse 31, if you guys want to flip there, pause it here. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he took the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bills run higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." And so Jesus tells this parable, not necessarily originally to address righteousness, but what he was addressing was, who should I love? Who is my neighbor? And so I want to do justice to that part that he's saying, especially when we think of the times and everything that has happened the past couple of weeks. You see, in the Jewish mindset, the Samaritans were evil people. They were not good people. They were not godly people. And so in their mind, they had every single right to hate them. They had every single right to look down upon them because of who they worshipped and how they worshipped and what they did. But Jesus did something different in this scenario. Instead of making the Samaritan the villain, the one who walked by, he made the priest. He made the priest and the temple assistant, the ones who worked at church. He made them the bad guys of the story. You see, because what Jesus was trying to convey here was that there is no racial bounds when it comes to God. I should say, there is no difference in people. There is no higher people and lesser people. We have no right to look down upon another just because of their background, just because of how they look. And that's what Jesus was establishing here, that we are called to love all kinds of people. And so what we can also learn from this, that has to do with righteousness, and the two kinds of righteousness were displayed beautifully in this story. Bringing it back to Matthew chapter 10, God blesses those who are persecuted for being righteous. So the two kinds of righteousness that we see in this story were the righteousness of those people from church and the righteousness of this Samaritan who you think would be despised. You see, the church leader and the temple assistant, they came by and they looked at the man bloodied and bruised, and they just saw something disgusting. They were like, looked at him and wanted nothing to do with him. And when you think about the Pharisaical mindset, that was a big word, the mindset of the Pharisees, the religious leaders back in the day, their mindset was, I want everybody to see how right I am. I want everyone to see my righteousness and my goodness. And I'm going to show that to people because I want status, I want power, I want people to look up to me. But you see, they're on some road in the middle of nowhere where no one could see what they did. And so they didn't respond in compassion. They probably would have, if it was in the middle of the city and this happened, they would have been the very first to jump on that opportunity because people could see them doing it. You see, that's the kind of heart, that's the kind of mindset that's not good. We do not love people because we want others to look at us and see how great we are. That's not the righteousness of God. That's the righteousness of man. And that's what we see in this world today. Especially here in Temecula, Murrieta. We're full of a lot of successful people, and God has blessed this area so much. But many a times, that can cause us to look down on people who society says are less than us. People who are poor in income. People who live in different areas. You see, but we have no right to do that. Now you have this Samaritan on the other hand, who's going to this area probably to trade. He's probably walking somewhere in the middle of Judea right now, completely a stranger to this land. And he helps this Jewish man who's not even, he's a foreigner. It's just this random dude. He wouldn't had no idea even knowing him. And he comes up and he shows compassion on him, and he nurses his wounds, and he binds them, and he brings him to an inn and pays for everything. And these are the two kinds of righteousness we can display, because this man, he wasn't concerned for himself. He wasn't concerned that in picking up this man, he would then slow his own journey, possibly thinking so he could be attacked. And he was then paying for this man. He gave up what was his for the good of this man. And so this is the kind of righteousness that we need to address, because we all know what right is, but why are we doing it? You see, this was the kind of righteousness that God showed us. You see, because Jesus humbled himself, became like men. Even though he was perfect, he subjugated himself to this sinful world. To be beaten, to be tortured, to be hung on a cross. But in that, he gave up his own life so that we would have life. And so this is how righteousness then in Scripture works. If we try to come to God and say, God, look at all I've done. Look at everything I've done. You have the pronoun wrong. Because God sees all that good works, those ways you benefited society, and says that's just filthy rags. There's nothing of eternal value there. You have your reward by how people view you. There's nothing lasting there. But you see, the righteousness that Jesus calls us to is not our own righteousness. You see what it is? It's saying, God, I can't be righteous without you. I am a sinful, broken human being. And I need your righteousness. And so when we put our faith in Jesus, that his work on the cross covered our sin, past, present, future, we then have a righteousness given to us. It is a free gift of God, is what this righteousness is. And so, now from here on, what righteousness looks like is not us trying to do all these good things so people think we're great and people think we're awesome, but instead what righteousness is I've been forgiven. I have been made new. And this is how God calls me to treat people. That even though there's this man beaten and bruised and bloodied on the side of the road, it's probably going to be disgusting to touch him because he's all bloodied and muddied and stuff. But I'm going to give up my own rights, my own desire to be clean. I'm going to help this man. Now that's going to look so different for each and every one of us, especially during this season. But the core of it's still the same. You see, right before this parable of this Good Samaritan is what's known as the golden rule, that you shall love the Lord God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength. And just as equally as important, you love your neighbor as yourself. That is the righteousness of God. And so when we are persecuted for that, when people look down on us for that, when we stand up for the broken, when we help those who are in need, and people look down at us for that, God blesses us. When we say and agree with God with what sin is, that's when God blesses us as well. The world might say, hey, you should, it's totally okay to have sex before marriage. And we say no, because God calls me to a different standard. And when people say, yeah, it's totally okay to cuss and use language and however you want, go ahead and use language however you want. We say no, God has a different standard. Not because we're great, but because there's a God who's great that we follow. When the world says it's okay to gossip and to treat people in a certain way, we say, no, God has a different standard. You see, all these things have something in common. The sin that is over here, in reality, what it does is it dehumanizes people. It makes us think less of them. But God has called us to a different standard. And that's what we follow. And so when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake, God will bless you. And the kingdom of heaven is yours. So when people look down upon you, when people think you're crazy for believing what you believe, when people don't understand and say, no, you shouldn't be doing that, God has a different standard. That's what we hold to. And it's his righteousness that we live by. I love you guys. I hope you have a great week and some great small group discussions tonight.